January 14th, 1944, southern Italy. The town of Aversa, 20 kilometers north of Naples. The winter sun hung low over the Campanian plain, pale and cold. A line of American supply trucks rumbled through the narrow streets, their engines growling over cobblestones that had carried Roman chariots 2,000 years before. Women in black shawls stood in doorways, their faces hollow, their eyes tracking the convoy with the blank stare of those who had learned not to hope. Children pressed against stone walls, skeletal arms wrapped around their own ribs. The air smelled of wood smoke and sewage, of a civilization stripped to its bones. And then one of the trucks stopped. The driver, a corporal from Ohio whose name would never make it into any history book, stepped down and walked to the rear of the vehicle. He unlocked the back doors. White vapor poured out into the Mediterranean afternoon like a conjurer's trick, like something from a dream. Inside that truck, hanging from steel hooks in neat rows, were sides of beef. Fresh, red, marbled with fat, refrigerated. The women who witnessed this moment would speak of it for the rest of their lives, not with the detached vocabulary of geopolitics or military strategy, but with the stunned reverence of those who had seen a miracle. Because in January 1944, in the shattered landscape of southern Italy, a refrigerated truck was not merely a logistical innovation. It was a statement of reality so profound, so incomprehensible to the European mind, that it redefined what was possible in the world. To understand the shock of that moment, one must first understand what Italy had become. By the winter of 1944, the Italian peninsula was a graveyard of empires. Mussolini's fascist dream had collapsed into nightmare. The Allied invasion at Salerno the previous September had been followed by months of grinding combat up the boot of Italy, through mountains and mud, past medieval towns reduced to rubble. The Gothic line loomed to the north. The Anzio landings would come within weeks. Between the retreating Germans and the advancing Allies, Italian civilians were crushed like grain between millstones. But the catastrophe had begun long before the first Allied soldier set foot on Italian soil. 20 years of fascist rule had hollowed out the Italian economy. Mussolini's dreams of Roman glory had drained the nation's resources into colonial adventures in Ethiopia and Libya, into a military machine built on propaganda rather than production capacity. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, declaring war on an already defeated France, the Italian people were not prepared for what would follow. They were not prepared for the meat rations that shrank month by month. They were not prepared for the cooking oil that disappeared from shops. They were not prepared for bread made increasingly from chestnut flour and sawdust. By 1942, the average Italian civilian was consuming fewer than 1,500 calories per day. By 1943, in the months before the Allied invasion, that number had fallen below 1,200 in many regions. Protein was a memory. Fresh meat was something grandmothers spoke of to children, who no longer believed such things had ever existed. The black market ruled everything, and the black market demanded gold, jewelry, family heirlooms. Women traded wedding rings for flour. Fathers sold their tools for a few grams of lard. The psychological impact of sustained hunger is well documented by nutritional science, but statistics cannot capture the spiritual erosion of a people. Hunger narrows the world. It reduces human consciousness to the immediate, the tactile, the desperately necessary. A hungry mother does not contemplate philosophy or politics. She contemplates whether her children will live until spring. The women of Aversa, of Naples, of Cassino and Salerno, and 10,000 other Italian towns, had spent 3 years watching their children's bones emerge through thinning skin. They had watched old people die in their sleep, their bodies finally surrendering to the mathematics of malnutrition. They had learned to stop crying because tears required water, and water required energy, and energy required calories they did not have. This was the Italy that had welcomed the Allied advance with desperate, wary hope, Hope because surely anything was better than what they had endured. Wary because the Germans, in their retreat, had made it clear what happened to Italian civilians who welcomed the enemy too warmly. The massacres at Sant'Anna di Stazzema and Marzabotto still lay in the future, but already the pattern was evident. Joy could be fatal. The Allied logistics system that rumbled into southern Italy in the autumn of 1943 was the most sophisticated supply apparatus ever constructed in human history. It had to be. The Allied command structure, led by General Dwight Eisenhower, with British General Harold Alexander commanding ground forces in Italy, understood that modern mechanized warfare consumed resources at a rate that would have seemed insane to generals of previous eras. A single American infantry division required approximately 600 tons of supplies per day. Ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, and food. Endless mountains of food, because the United States Army had learned a fundamental lesson that European militaries still struggled to accept. Soldiers who ate well fought better. The American military doctrine emphasized caloric abundance. The standard American field ration provided between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day, more than triple what the average Italian civilian consumed. This was not mere generosity, it was calculated military efficiency. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had studied the performance data from the First World War and reached an unambiguous conclusion. Hungry men made mistakes, moved slowly, fell sick, and broke under pressure. Well-fed soldiers performed better in every measurable category. But feeding an army in the field, thousands of miles from home, required more than merely shipping food across the Atlantic. It required a revolution in preservation and transport. The refrigerated truck was the visible symbol of that revolution, but it was merely the tip of a vast logistical iceberg. Behind those trucks stood refrigerated warehouses in Naples and Bari and Taranto. Behind the warehouses stood refrigerated cargo ships crossing the Mediterranean. Behind those ships stood the Liberty ship fleet crossing the Atlantic, 60 vessels a month by 1943, each one capable of carrying 9,000 tons of cargo. Behind the Liberty ships stood the American agricultural colossus, the vast mechanized farms of the Midwest and the Central Valley of California, producing food in quantities that European agriculture could not match. The scale was staggering. In 1943, the United States produced over 25 billion pounds of beef. American farmers harvested over 3 billion bushels of wheat. Food production had not merely been maintained during wartime, it had increased, because American farms had mechanized on a scale European farmers still found difficult to comprehend. A single American farmer, operating a gasoline-powered tractor and a mechanical harvester, could work acreage that would require 20 European farmers with horse-drawn equipment. This industrial approach to agriculture produced surpluses so vast that the United States could feed its own expanding population, supply its military, and still export food to its allies. The refrigerated truck symbolized all of this. It represented not just the tactical ability to transport fresh meat to forward areas, but the strategic depth of an economy so powerful it could afford to dedicate precious steel, rubber, and manufacturing capacity to keeping beef cold. European militaries transported preserved rations, salted meat, canned goods. The Americans transported steaks. When the women of Aversa saw that vapor pour from the truck, their first reaction was not joy, it was disbelief so profound it bordered on denial. Maria Gentile was 28 years old in January 1944. She had been married for 6 years. Her husband was somewhere in the north, perhaps dead, perhaps a prisoner, perhaps still fighting for Mussolini's pathetic rump republic of Salo. She had 2 children, ages 4 and 2. For 18 months she had kept them alive through a combination of ingenuity, desperation, and the kind of moral calculations that haunt a person for the rest of their life. She had sold her mother's gold cross. She had traded her wedding dress for 10 pounds of wormy flour. She had done other things she would never speak of, not to her children, not to anyone. When Maria saw the fresh beef hanging in that refrigerated truck, her mind could not process what her eyes reported. The cognitive dissonance was too extreme. Fresh meat in January, in a truck, refrigerated. These things did not coexist in her understanding of reality. She had assumed, in the unconscious way people assume the physical laws that govern their universe, that fresh meat in winter was impossible. Rich people might have it, because they could slaughter animals on demand and consume them immediately. But to transport it? To keep it fresh during transport? To have so much of it that an army could be fed this way? Her first thought, which she would later recall with something between shame and amusement, was that the Americans must have won the war by accident. Surely any nation stupid enough to waste resources on refrigerated trucks could not have developed the competence to win battles. It must have been luck. German incompetence, something other than genuine superiority. But then the American soldiers began distributing the meat, not selling it, not trading it, distributing it, just giving it away to Italian civilians as part of the civil affairs operation to prevent starvation and disease in the occupied zones. Maria received 4 pounds of beef. 4 pounds. She held it in her hands and felt its weight and its coldness, and she began to cry. Not tears of joy, but tears of a more complex emotion, a grief-tinged bewilderment at what this meat represented about the world, about how wrong everything had been, about how much she had not understood. She was not alone in this reaction. Dozens of Italian women stood in that street in Aversa, holding American meat, crying. Some of the American soldiers seemed embarrassed by this response. They had been trained for combat, not for being the agents of theological revelation. Because that was what this moment approached, for the women receiving that meat. A religious experience, the sudden understanding that the universe operated by rules they had not known existed. The historical record preserves fragments of these encounters. U.S. Army Civil Affairs reports from southern Italy in early 1944 document the distribution of food to civilian populations. The reports are bureaucratic, focused on quantities and logistical challenges. They mention that civilians expressed gratitude and that distribution proceeded without significant incident. But buried in the archives of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, in oral history interviews conducted decades later, the human dimension emerges. Lucia Esposito, interviewed in 1989 at age 71, remembered the trucks clearly. "We thought they must be foolish," she said, "to waste so much, to be so careless with food. We had been taught that struggle was noble, that sacrifice was the highest virtue. The Germans were always telling us this, and before them the fascists, that we must suffer for greatness. And then came these Americans with their trucks full of meat, and they were smiling. They were not grim, they were not suffering. They were healthy, and their teeth were good, and they gave away food as if it cost nothing. We realized that everything we had been told was a lie, not just a political lie, but a lie about reality itself." This was the deeper shock, not merely that the Americans had more resources, but that they seemed to operate under an entirely different philosophy of existence. The European experience of the 20th century had been dominated by ideologies of sacrifice. Communism demanded the sacrifice of individual desire for the collective good. Fascism demanded the sacrifice of individual will to the state and the leader. Both systems treated material abundance with suspicion, as something corrupting, something that weakened the martial virtues necessary for historical greatness. Suffering was pedagogy. Hunger built character. This was not merely propaganda. These ideas were deeply embedded in European intellectual culture, in the writings of philosophers and the pronouncements of leaders across the political spectrum. The Americans arrived with a completely different message, though they rarely articulated it explicitly. They demonstrated it. Their message was that abundance was possible, that suffering was not necessary for greatness, that people could be both well-fed and free, both comfortable and courageous. This was heresy to the ideological framework that had dominated Europe for 2 decades. The refrigerated truck became a symbol of this philosophical divide. It represented the American conviction that logistics mattered more than heroic spirit, that engineering was a higher virtue than endurance, that the goal of a properly ordered society was not to glorify suffering but to eliminate it. This was not mere materialism, though European critics would later dismiss it as such. It was a fundamentally different vision of what human beings could achieve and what they deserved. As winter turned to spring in 1944, the American supply network in Italy expanded. More refrigerated trucks arrived. Portable ice plants were established in Naples, and later in Rome after its liberation in June. American engineers installed electrical refrigeration units in buildings that had never known such technology. The contrast between American logistical culture and what had come before became increasingly stark. The German army, in its retreat up the Italian peninsula, operated under entirely different principles. German military doctrine emphasized living off the land, requisitioning what was needed from conquered or occupied territory. This approach had worked, after a fashion, in the vast agricultural expanses of Ukraine and southern Russia, though even there it had contributed to mass starvation among civilian populations. In the mountains of Italy, with a population already on the edge of famine, German requisitioning was a death sentence. Wehrmacht units seized food stocks, commandeered livestock, stripped villages of anything edible. The suffering this caused was not incidental to German operations. It was a predictable consequence of their logistical philosophy. Italian civilians quickly learned to distinguish between German and American supply doctrines. The Germans took, the Americans brought. This was not a matter of national character, but of economic capacity and strategic choice. Germany, fighting a multi-front war against enemies with vastly greater resources, could not afford to supply its troops from distant homeland industries. It had to extract what it needed from conquered territories. The United States, protected by 2 oceans and possessing the world's largest economy, could afford to supply its troops entirely from American production. This meant that American forces did not need to compete with Italian civilians for food. American units arrived with their own supplies, abundant and varied, and when those supplies exceeded immediate military needs, they could be distributed to civilian populations. The psychological impact of this difference cannot be overstated. For Italian women who had endured German occupation and then German retreat, the American presence was shocking precisely because it did not conform to their understanding of how occupying armies behaved. Armies conquered, exploited, extracted, and destroyed. That was the lesson of history. But these Americans seemed to be following a different script. They brought food rather than taking it. They established field hospitals and treated Italian civilians alongside their own wounded. They employed Italians in labor battalions and paid them, not in worthless occupation currency, but in goods and food. Rosa Colombo, a schoolteacher from Cassino, recorded her observations in a diary that survived the war. An entry from March 1944 reads, "Today I saw American soldiers playing with Italian children, giving them chocolate. The children had forgotten what chocolate was. Some of the youngest had never tasted it. The soldiers seemed to find this situation natural, unremarkable. They did not act as conquerors, but as visitors who happened to have extra sweets in their pockets. I do not know what to make of people who fight a war this way. We were told the Americans were soft, corrupted by wealth, incapable of sacrifice. But they have traveled halfway around the world to fight battles that are not theirs, in mountains and mud, and they do this while eating fresh meat and giving chocolate to enemy children. Perhaps we understood nothing about power. Perhaps power is not the willingness to suffer, but the capacity to make suffering unnecessary." The symbolic weight of American material abundance was not lost on Allied commanders. Psychological warfare specialists within the Allied command structure understood that the contrast between American plenty and Axis scarcity could be weaponized. Leaflets dropped over German positions in Italy often featured images of captured German soldiers eating American rations, living in warm quarters, receiving medical care. The message was not subtle. Surrender and you will eat better than you have in years. For German soldiers, subsisting on black bread and ersatz coffee, facing another winter in Italian mountains, these leaflets had impact. But for Italian civilians, the propaganda was unnecessary, because the reality was everywhere visible. American supply convoys rolled through towns daily. American field kitchens produced meals whose smells, frying bacon, fresh bread, real coffee, drifted through streets where people had not smelled such things in years. The sheer waste that accompanied American abundance was itself shocking. Italian children learned to follow American camps, scavenging from garbage bins, and what they found in American trash was better than what they could obtain on the black market. Half-eaten portions of canned peaches, discarded white bread, cigarettes barely smoked. Teresa Martino, who was 12 years old in 1944, later recalled, "We fought over the Americans' garbage. This was not shameful to us because their garbage was treasure. I found a can of condensed milk with perhaps a quarter remaining. I took it home, and my mother wept when she saw it. We had not had milk in so long. We mixed it with water, and all 5 of us shared it, making it last for days. And this was garbage to them. They had thrown it away. What kind of people had so much they could throw away condensed milk?" This question, what kind of people, haunted Italian consciousness in those months. The answer was profoundly unsettling to the ideological certainties that had governed Italian life for 2 decades. Fascist doctrine had taught that Italy was a proletarian nation, young and vigorous, standing against the decadent plutocracies of the West. The plutocracies were supposed to be weak, their people soft and cowardly, their societies decaying under the weight of luxury and individualism. But the Americans who arrived in Italy in 1943 and 1944 did not match this description. They were vigorous, healthy, confident. Their society had sent them across an ocean with refrigerated trucks full of fresh meat. The plutocracy was outproducing, outfighting, and outfeeding the proletarian nation. The ideological framework collapsed under the weight of observable reality. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pushed north toward the Gothic Line, the integration of Italian civilians into the Allied supply system had become routine. Italian women worked in American laundries, mess halls, and supply depots. Italian men worked on road crews and construction projects. The payment for this work included food rations, and those rations were calculated on American standards. Workers received canned meat, flour, sugar, coffee, and cigarettes. These goods became a second currency in Italian society, more valuable than the inflated lira. The transformation this wrought in Italian attitudes was documented by Allied observers. A civil affairs report from August 1944 noted, "Civilian population shows increasing orientation toward Allied forces, and particularly toward American cultural norms. American films are extremely popular. Civilians express desire to learn English. Women inquire about American cooking methods and home appliances." He stood there for hours, just watching. Finally, he came over and asked me, through an interpreter, if America was real. I didn't understand the question at first. He clarified, was America a real place, like Italy or France, or was it something else, something outside normal geography? Because no normal country could do what he was seeing. The scale was too large, the waste too casual. It had to be something else. I tried to explain that yes, America was real, it was just very big and very productive. But I don't think he believed me. I think he died believing America was a kind of myth, a place that couldn't really exist according to the rules he understood. This anecdote captures something essential about the Italian experience of American power in 1944. It was not just impressive, it was ontologically disturbing. It suggested that the rules governing human society were different than Italians had been taught. Scarcity was not inevitable. Sacrifice was not always necessary. A society could be rich and strong simultaneously. These ideas challenged assumptions so deep they were barely conscious. The refrigerated truck became, in Italian memory, a synecdoche for this entire complex of realizations. When Italian grandmothers, decades later, told their grandchildren about the war, many of them mentioned those trucks. Not the battles, not the bombing, but the trucks that held fresh meat in January. The trucks that said everything they had been told was wrong. The trucks that came from a country where refrigeration was so common, so unremarkable, that it could be put on wheels and driven into a war zone. The contrast between expectation and reality defined the Italian encounter with American power, but it was not unique to Italy. Across the European and Pacific theatres, Axis soldiers and civilians confronted the same bewildering abundance. German prisoners of war, processed through American camps, were fed better than they had been fed in the Wehrmacht. Japanese civilians in occupied territories watched American Seabees build infrastructure in weeks that Japanese engineers had claimed would take months. Filipino guerrillas fighting alongside Americans discovered that American supply doctrine meant that even irregular troops could be equipped with modern weapons and fed well. But in Italy, the contrast was perhaps most stark because of the ideological intensity of Italian fascism. Mussolini's regime had been built on the aestheticization of poverty, the glorification of struggle. Fascist architecture was grandiose but bare, emphasizing stone and severity. Fascist rhetoric praised the lean and hungry fighter over the comfortable civilian. Fascist economic policy prioritized autarky and self-sufficiency over abundance and trade. When this ideological structure confronted American material reality, it shattered. The women who saw the refrigerated trucks in January 1944 had been shaped by 20 years of fascist culture. They had internalized, to varying degrees, the values of that culture: duty, sacrifice, hierarchy, struggle. The Americans offered a different set of values, though not in explicit ideological terms. The Americans offered the value of competence over rhetoric, of results over symbolism, of practical problem-solving over ideological purity. And they demonstrated these values through infrastructure, through bridges rebuilt, ports reopened, and trucks full of refrigerated meat. Maria Gentile, the woman who received beef in Aversa, survived the war. She lived until 1987. In the 1970s, she gave an interview to an Italian magazine about her memories of the war. She said, "People ask me about the liberation of Italy, about the end of fascism, about freedom and democracy, and I understand these are important historical events. But when I remember that time, I do not think about politics. I think about meat. I think about standing in a street holding 4 pounds of beef and realizing that everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. That is what liberation meant to me. Not abstract freedom, but the concrete understanding that life did not have to be the way it had been. The Americans did not give us freedom. They gave us meat, and the meat proved that freedom was possible." The epilogue of this story extends beyond 1944, beyond the end of the war, into the reconstruction of Italy and the creation of the post-war order. The Marshall Plan, which provided over $12 billion in aid to Western Europe between 1948 and 1952, was, in many ways, an extension of the same philosophy embodied by the refrigerated trucks. The plan assumed that prosperity was possible, that scarcity could be defeated through applied resources and intelligent organization, that democracies could flourish if people were well fed and secure. Italy was a major beneficiary of Marshall Plan aid, receiving over $1.5 billion. This money rebuilt infrastructure, modernized industry, and supported the development of what became known as the Italian economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s. By 1960, Italy had transformed from a defeated, starving nation into a prosperous industrial democracy. The women who had wept over American beef in 1944 lived to see their children educated, employed, and eating fresh meat without wonder or tears. Was this transformation caused by American aid? History is never so simple. Italian resilience, European recovery, global economic trends, the Cold War context, all these factors played roles. But the symbolic power of American material abundance in shaping Italian attitudes toward democracy and capitalism cannot be dismissed. The refrigerated trucks, the chocolate bars, the fresh bread, these tangible evidences of American power created a receptivity to American political and economic models that might not have existed otherwise. The deeper truth that the refrigerated truck revealed was about the relationship between material conditions and human possibility. For decades, Europeans had been told by various ideological movements that human fulfillment required sacrifice, that greatness demanded suffering, that abundance was corrupting. The American example suggested otherwise. It suggested that humans could be both comfortable and courageous, both prosperous and purposeful. It suggested that the goal of political economy should be the elimination of unnecessary suffering, rather than its glorification. This was not a perfect truth. American society had its own profound contradictions, its own sites of suffering and injustice. The same nation that sent refrigerated trucks to Italy maintained racial segregation at home. The same economy that produced such abundance would later generate enormous inequality. The critique of American capitalism offered by European socialists and communists was not without merit. But in January 1944, on a street in Aversa, none of those future complications were visible. What was visible was a truck full of fresh meat, cold in defiance of the Mediterranean winter, abundant in defiance of wartime scarcity, free in defiance of every economic logic that had governed Italian life for decades. What was visible was an alternative to the ideology of sacrifice, a proof that the world could be organized differently. The women who received that meat carried its lesson for the rest of their lives. They taught it to their children, not in explicit political terms, but in the lived wisdom of those who had seen one world end and another begin. They taught that abundance was possible, that engineering mattered, that democracies could be strong, that sacrifice was not the highest virtue. They taught, in essence, what the refrigerated trucks had demonstrated, that a society organized around human flourishing rather than historical destiny could produce miracles that ideology could only promise. And perhaps this is the final meaning of those trucks, rumbling through Italian streets in the winter of 1944. They were not merely vehicles. They were prophecies in steel, carrying not just meat but a vision of what the post-war world might become. A world where technology served human needs, where abundance was distributed rather than hoarded, where the purpose of power was not domination but the elimination of hunger. That vision was imperfectly realized in the decades that followed. It remains imperfectly realized today. But for the women who stood in the cold January sun, holding American beef and crying, the vision was real enough to believe in, real enough to remember, real enough to change everything.